Shalom, which means peace, and also used to say hello. This is Don Baker, and in the next few minutes, I'm going to attempt to give you a little synopsis of a trip my wife Debbie and I took to the Holy Land, and specifically Jerusalem, in November of 2014. The purpose being to give you a better understanding of how Jerusalem is oriented and where things are and what the major sites are. Basically in 6 parts, I'll be talking about history, the Mount of Olives, the Temple Mount, Via Dolorosa, the Holy Sepulchre, and the Western or Wailing Wall. And so with that, let's begin. Here is Israel as it exists today with its Middle Eastern neighbors. As you can see, Israel officially is everything you see in yellow there, but it also controls the areas in white, which are the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights. And I'll be talking a little more about those in the next couple of charts. Following World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the British were given control of the area you see in white, and they designated via the Palestinian Mandate that this area would be that area which would be given to the Jews for their reinstatement as a nation. By 1922, more than 75% of that white area was renamed Transjordan and given back to the Arabs, leaving only the area in white for Jewish Palestine. By 1924, Jewish Palestine was further divided up into Jewish and Palestinian Arab areas in blue and brown, with Jerusalem, the little white area, being designated as an internationally administered city. And as you can see on this next slide, this was more or less the arrangement when Israel became a state in 1948. The only differences being that after the war in 1948, Jordan controlled the West Bank, Egypt the Gaza Strip, and Israel had the rest, which was in orange on the chart. And on this slide, we see a blow-up of the West Bank, and we can see how Jerusalem is squeezed between Israel and the West Bank. But again, this area is still controlled by Israel, and as we see on this slide, even though the old city is in East Jerusalem, being controlled by Israel makes administering the area still their responsibility. On this slide, you can see the 3 main geographic regions of Israel, that being the coastal plain, the mountains of which Jerusalem sits in, and the Jordan River Valley. Here we see the first depiction of the old city with the Temple Mount in the middle, and as it expands out, you see the 4 quarters of the old city, that being the Muslim, the Christian, the Armenian, and the Jewish quarters. From a point in the far northwest corner of the depiction, we are going to look to the southeast and see many of the most important sites of Jerusalem, including on the far right, the Mount of Olives. On this slide, looking in the same southeasterly direction, you can see the Dead Sea in the very far top of the picture. Below it, the Mount of Olives, and then the old city itself, showing the various quarters. In about the middle of the picture, you can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we'll be going to and spending some time looking at later in the briefing. Once again, looking at the depiction, we are now moving up into the upper right of the picture, looking to the southwest, and particularly we're going to be going and looking at the Mount of Olives, which is on the right. And you can see also there a trail which will show the path we're going to take through the city on this briefing. So here's the first picture looking from that spot, and you can see the Mount of Olives on the left, and the Temple Mount in the middle, and way up over on the right is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So we are now going to look at the Mount of Olives from a point looking directly to the east, where you will see many of its key sites. So basically, looking from the Temple Mount, we see the Mount of Olives itself, and there's lots of interesting things that, of course, occurred here. Most notable being the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus spent the last night praying before his crucifixion, and a Basilica of Agony that remembers that. Up on the top of the hill, the chapel or Dome of Ascension, where Christ rose into heaven after his 40-day resurrection, and the Church of Mary Magdalene. So now let's look at each one of these a little more closely, starting with the Garden of Gethsemane. Here we see some olive trees in the garden, which exemplify what Jesus sat in while he was praying. And here we see the Basilica of Agony with the Garden of Gethsemane on the left, and a further close-up of it, also called the Church of All Nations. And here we see the inside of the church and a beautiful mural depicting his agony. Next, it's up to the Chapel of the Ascension, where Christ ascended into the heavens after his crucifixion after 40 days. Here you see a beautiful domed chapel. And very close to it is the Dome of Ascension, inside of which has the Ascension Rock, where Christ purportedly left the earth. And here's a close-up of the Ascension Rock with what is purported the footprint of Jesus. Just down the hill a bit from the Dome of Ascension is the Russian Orthodox Church of the Mary Magdalene, in remembrance of her and her relationship with Jesus. Now back to the depiction, we're going to turn around and look to the west and look at some things regarding the Temple Mount. Again, you can see the trail headed from the upper right down and up to the Mount of Olives, and now we're going to take the trail down from the Mount of Olives into the Kidron Valley. Looking from the Mount of Olives westerly over the Kidron Valley, we see the Temple Mount inside the four walls of a rectangle. The Temple Mount is, of course, the place where the original Jewish temple was located. But before that, it was also known as Mount Moriah, and of course this was where Abraham went to offer up his son Isaac for sacrifice. Looking again at the Temple Mount, we see the Dome of the Rock sitting in the middle where the original Jewish temple used to be. We also see the Golden Gate in the front, the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the left, and the Wailing or Western Wall to the rear. Also on the far right, you see the Via Dolorosa. And here's the Dome of the Rock with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the background, which the Via Dolorosa leads up to. This is a close-up picture of the Golden Gate, which has more or less been closed for centuries, but is believed to be the gate which Jesus entered during the last week of his ministry and will someday enter again upon his second coming. I would now like to talk about the Dome of the Rock, which you can see in this picture looking over the Church of Mary Magdalene. It is important to point out that the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque, but is a Muslim shrine set up for followers of Islam to visit. The mosque is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is located directly to the south of it, also inside the Temple Mount. The Dome of the Rock has been on this site and has existed for more than 1,400 years. The dome was actually built in 638 AD. Prior to that time, the previous 600 years since the dispersion of the Jews had been a Christian pilgrimage site, which remained friendly to them until the Crusades around 1100 AD. While being briefly recaptured by the Christians, in 1200 it was once again captured by the Muslims and has been a Muslim shrine ever since. The Dome of the Rock sits directly on top of the foundation stone which is purportedly to be the exact location where Abraham sacrificed Isaac and where the Holy of Holies was in the original Jewish temple. This cutout shows the inside of the dome with the foundation stone in the middle. And here we see a shot of the beautiful interior of the dome with the stone in the background, which you cannot see here. But in this picture and the ones to follow, you can get an idea of what the stone actually looks like inside. This is a picture looking straight down onto the foundation stone. And this picture shows in the lower right a rectangular square where the actual Ark of the Covenant supposedly was located. And here we see, looking up, the inside of the dome itself. Before leaving the dome, it is important to note that inscribed on the walls, both inside and outside, are the words that clearly differentiate the Islamic view of Christ from Christianity, that being that Christ was a prophet under Muhammad only and not as part of the Godhead itself. We are now going to travel from the east side to the south side of the old city and look at where the original city of David was. And here you can see it around 1000 BC when David was king, with Mount Moriah, where the Dome of the Rock now sits, just to the north. And here you can see how the city of Jerusalem grew up till Christ's time with the addition of infrastructure to the west and the temple itself just north of the original city of David. And in this photograph, we can see what the actual ruins of Lower Jerusalem and the city of David look like today, with the Al-Aqsa Mosque up at the top. If you ever wondered what the temple looked like, here's a depiction of the temple as it appeared at Christ's day. It's called the Second Temple because the first was Solomon's, and the second was built after the Babylonian captivity and renovated by Herod in about 25 BC. On the back right-hand side of the temple is something called Antonia Fortress, which is where Pilate operated out of and conducted the trial with Jesus. And here's a shot looking directly to the west, similar to what one of the earlier pictures looked like, and you can see the development of the city on the south side and rather rural on the north, where the actual crucifixion site was. Here's a picture looking from the other side of the temple, and in the foreground you can see where it's believed Golgotha and the crucifixion site were. Why isn't the temple there today? Because in AD 70, the Romans came and pillared the city to quell the Jewish uprising against Roman rule. And this is a depiction of what that might have looked like. From the eastern side of the city, we are now going to enter the Lion's Gate and go down the Via Dolorosa, also known as the Way of Sorrows, where Jesus traveled the last night before he was crucified. The Via Dolorosa consists of 14 stations, starting from the Antonia Fortress, which you saw earlier, and traveling through the city all the way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where it's believed Jesus was crucified and buried. Station number 1 is the Antonia Fortress, where the trial with Pilate occurred, and this is on the back right-hand side of the Temple Mount. It should be noted that Antonia Fortress no longer exists, but it's still marked as on a place on the Via Dolorosa. Station 2 is a monastery of flagellation, marking the spot where Jesus was whipped and beaten. This is Station 3, marking one of 3 places that Jesus fell during his carrying of the cross to Golgotha. And here we have Station 5, which was one of 4 stations where Jesus had encounters with various people. This one being Simon of Cyrene, who was summoned to carry his cross for him. The final 5 stations are at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was crucified and buried. And here we have a graphical depiction looking directly to the east through the Jaffa Gate. Looking from here, you can see in the lower right something called David's Citadel, which actually was the location of Herod's palace. But then over on the top left, you see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the absence of the Jewish temple, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is considered by many to be the most sacred Christian Jewish shrine now. And it actually represents where they believe both the crucifixion and the burial occurred, with a church over top of both sites. Here is a more close-up view of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, notable by its 2 domes, one more or less for the crucifixion site and the other for the burial tomb. In the lower left, you'll see the courtyard where you go in, which we'll see on the next slide. This then is the courtyard entrance, and we'll be going through that door right in the middle there. On the top of one of the domes is the cross of Golgotha. So here's an actual cutaway of the church, and we're going to take a little trip through it and look at these various stations, starting from the courtyard, which you just saw, going up and to the right, first into the chapel of the crucifixion. After that, we will go down to the stone of anointing and then into the Holy Sepulchre. So just inside the front door, you turn sharply to the right and go up these stairs to the Chapel of Crucifixion and stations 10 through 12. At the top of the stairs are 3 beautiful chapels, beginning with station 10, depicting nailing to the cross. Just to the left of the nailing of the cross is the Chapel of Crucifixion. And in the chapel, you can see the beautiful depiction of Christ on the cross, and just below it is the actual rock of Calvary, which you can see through the glass windows, and in the middle actually reach down and touch. And this graphical depiction from the side shows you on the right hand side how this rock, the gray part, actually sticks up into the chapel, where you can go into the Chapel of Crucifixion and actually see it. And just to the left of the Chapel of Crucifixion, station 11, is station 12, which is the Lady of Sorrows, Mary, showing her mourning of the crucifixion. Back down the stairs from the crucifixion site, we come to the Stone of Anointing with a beautiful mosaic in the background showing the intermediate stages of Christ's crucifixion and burial. The first mosaic is removing Christ from the cross, shown here. The second mosaic is anointing him on the anointing stone. And one more picture of the stone in the foreground with a lady praying and the mosaic in the background. Station number 13. Back to the cutout, we are now leaving the anointing stone and entering the actual area of the sepulchre itself. And this is the sepulchre itself, containing the tomb of Jesus. So if you ask, how can this be the tomb of Jesus? This depiction again shows you how this sepulchre was placed where they felt the tomb was, inside a hill that has now been excavated to make room for this church. And on one side of it is the Chapel of the Angel Stone, depicting the stone that covered it. And on the other side is the most holy place, which is the tomb of Christ Chapel. And inside of it is a beautiful arrangement where people come and pray. And it is a place, of course, where special services are conducted like this one at Easter time. Leaving the sepulchre, we enter the Armenian Catholicon, and above it, the dome, which has a beautiful mural of Christ. Now, if you're troubled by the idea that Christ was crucified and buried so close together, and inside the sepulchre there is another theory, and that is that he was crucified and buried further north at the Skull Hill and the Garden Tomb. So here we have an outside shot of the Garden Tomb, which I think to many looks a lot more like what we think of the tomb as looking like. And then a picture inside the tomb where you can see rocks where supposedly the angels sat. And then Golgotha, or Skull Hill, where it's believed he was actually crucified, and you can actually see the face of a skull in the mountainside there. These two locations being a couple hundred yards apart from each other. Anyway, from either of the sites of crucifixion and burial, it was then onward through the passageways and walkways to the Jewish sector and the Western Wall. Here again we have our depiction showing in the lower left-hand side our route from the sepulchre to the Western Wall, and you can see the picture that we will be taking from the lower left-hand side looking at the wall. So coming out of the Jewish sector, right about where the yellow banner is, we walk out onto the area of the Western Wall, which is the most holy of Jewish locations in the Old City. It is so because it's the closest place to where the actual rock of Moriah was located, under the Dome of the Rock, which was where Abraham sacrificed his son Isaac, and where the temple was, of course, originally built. And so this is, of course, where Jews and, of course, other Christians and the like come to offer their prayers to God at the closest point to the Temple Mount. And here we see some soldiers doing just that and leaving notes with other people in the walls to be read by the Lord. So anyway, this ends our tour, and you can imagine this was quite a special day we had. And there's a picture of us just proving that we in fact were there. But just to make it a little more special, as we left in the bus driver played for us this song as we drove out of Jerusalem and back to our ship. Shalom, and thank you for listening. Jerusalem.